Welcome to a video podcast presented by Highlands Professional Development. I'm Max Guazzato. I'm a prosthodontist located in Sydney. Highlands Professional Development and I don't have any financial interest in any of the products which may be discussed during this video podcast. The objective of this video podcast is exclusively informative. If you're interested in other video podcasts or any activity about Highlands Professional Development, please visit www.highlandspd.com.au. Today, I have a great pleasure to have a chat with Sasha Hein about color in dentistry. Sasha, thank you for making some time. I know you just had a baby girl and you're doing so much work. We see you everywhere. So I feel really honored that you had the time to come and chat with us and share your extensive knowledge and ideas. I have to say my memory of you goes back to when you were living in Perth and working where you had your own laboratory at that time. And I saw some of your understanding articles on platinum foil and ceramics. Then you left Australia. What year did you leave Australia?
It was, I think, in September 2013.
13, so it's already a while ago. Went back to Germany, and
That's
then
right.
my next memory related to you was about my ceramist in our laboratory using your application. So this is from Sasha, matching color eLAB. I think what really made me curious about the application is that from that point on, we just stopped doing biscuits, try-ins, and we basically prepare the tooth, take some photographs as he was telling me to do it, and then send everything. And in the next appointment was 92% with our statistics at the time. I was issuing a central incisor. The patient wasn't able to understand which tooth we restore. So, which to me was an amazing breakthrough. Now I understand you're doing a PhD in computational color science under Professor Stephen Westland at Leeds University. Sasha, we really want to know more about you. So I know that you prepare a few slides for us. I would appreciate if you share your screen and tell us about you.
Okay. All right, Max, thanks very much for the kind introduction. Yeah, that's true. We go back a long time, don't we? So I lived in Western Australia for about 13 years in total. And I think we might have bumped into each other one of those dental conferences over East in Sydney and in Adelaide, I think. So yes, it's quite nice to catch up after all these years, across large distances. So so I used to have my own dental laboratory in Perth in Western Australia, in West Perth to be precise. This is what my humble little lab looked like at the time. It was a very small boutique lab, and this was the team that worked with me. You can see I look notably younger then. I was like in my early 30s at the time. I'm now in my late 40s. And these were I was part of a restorative team in Perth, and these were the professionals that I worked mostly with. This is Dr. Brendan Joyce. He's a prosthodontist in West Perth. Crofton Dennis is an orthodontist, and Wendy Gill, of course, is a periodontist. So between pros, ortho, and perio, we had a lot of these quite complicated multidisciplinary cases that we did during the time in Perth. But really, very often, what I had to do at the time in Perth was single center restorations, and I was really surprised by this, because in my time in Germany and other places, other countries where I worked, you'd have the odd single center every now and so often, but not nearly with the frequency than at the time in Australia. And it was only fairly recently, last year, when I did research for my PhD transfer Viva. So in the UK, when you're a PhD student towards the end of your first year, you have to present a transfer Viva and defend it in front of a panel to be allowed to continue and complete your PhD research. And it was during this literature review that I did for my PhD Viva that I came across this paper here by Nikolai Stankiewicz. He was at Melbourne University under Pete Wilson when he was still there. And they did a survey where they wanted to find out what kinds of restorations, general practitioners and prosthodontists were placing in Australia. And as a side finding, they concluded that the most frequently crowned tooth was the maxillary central incisor with 15.6%. So that's quite an interesting fact that the maxillary central incisors are such a common feature in the Australian dental market, right? And so having this little boutique dental lab in Perth and servicing prosthodontist practices, we had lots and lots and lots of these single center restorations. And this is just, just a couple that we did over the time that I had to make over the time. I would say there were about maybe close to 100 a year, something like that. It was really quite a lot. And I enjoyed making single central restorations at the time, but at the same time, it could also be very, very frustrating. And the reason why it was frustrating is because, what I'm showing you right now, of course, is only my best work, right? It's pure survival bias, okay? So I only show you like the best 4 or 5 cases I had every year, and we don't talk about the other 95% cases, right? Which is what everybody on stage tends to do, right? But the reality was, in truth, the reality was that very often you start a single central case like this, and this was before eLAB, so we still had to do BISPEC try-ins, right? And you found yourself at this stage, like where your intuition was completely wrong, and you thought it was going to work out really well in the mouth, and then you tried it and it looked like this, right? So the color didn't match at all, and then it was a real stretch and very time-consuming, often very, very frustrating to go from this, to this. This is not anything that you do with the second try. Often it would take 4 or 5 attempts in certain cases to color match at least reasonably well, and then very often they would look good on photographs, but not necessarily when you see them, right? So it was this inconsistency in my color matching skills, the sheer necessity that has led to what would become eLAB and the development of the eLAB system, which had already started while I was still in Perth. The initial research started around 2010, and I joined with these 2 gentlemen here on the right. This is Dr. Panagiotis Vatsos. He's Greek-American. He studied dentistry at USC in America, and later on did orthodontics at Edinburgh University. He practices on a small island in the Peloponnese in Greece. And then person next to him is Dr. Javier Tapia. He's a general practitioner from Madrid in Spain. He's got interesting computers and stuff. He does amazing graphics and that kind of thing. And the 3 of us, we got together as part of the bioemulation group, of which I was president at some point, together with Javier, and we wanted to hack this color matching problem. And then this led to a couple of publications. These ones here was the seminal work that was published on eLAB. And I'm not a career academic. I'm still a dental technician at heart. But I mean, these papers have been received quite well in the dental literature, have been cited many times. The seminal work's been cited quite a lot, and I think it managed to sort of put instrumental shape measurement back on the map, which had pretty much vanished up until then. Instrumental shape measurement was a big thing in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and then it went through a winter, if you want, and then we let it out of this winter and to a new era of instrumental shape measurement, which is now quite present today. And then later in my career, I've decided to join Leeds University. This is our campus here. So Leeds is in the northeast of England. The tropical part of England. The tropical part of England.
If you can say so, tropical about
If
England.
you can say so, yeah.
Yes.
It's a bit like Australia, but without the weather sort of thing. It's
exactly.
interesting. and this is me at one of the research labs at the Graduate School for Color Science and Technology. And this is my supervisor. This is my professor, Stephen Weston, who's a very famous color scientist in the world. He's done a lot of published research papers and collaboration with various industries and stuff, with the BBC and large companies as well. So I'm quite blessed that he took me on as a PhD student now towards the end of my second year in July. So I've got another year to go until next year, July, until I hand in my thesis. And besides all of that, I still lecture on eLAB and still look after the community. This was a lecture that I did just a few weeks ago for the British Academy of Cosmetic Dentistry in London. And besides that, I reside in Freiburg. I still live in Freiburg. I travel forth and back between Leeds and Freiburg. about maybe 4 or 5 times a year with specific research projects. And that's pretty much what I've been doing since I've left Australia, since the last 11, 12 years.
Awesome. I love Freiburg. I've been in there a couple of times with the International College of Prosthodontics. It's a beautiful city. It's the perfect site for quality of life and work. That's what my gut feeling. If I can make a comment, you know, when you say I'm just a technician, not an academic, but can I tell you, Sasha, I really feel that we really lack of quality teaching at dental laboratory level. Technician coming out, they maybe know about ExoCAD, but they really lack of fundamental knowledge. And in Australia, you know that the course for dental technology is really 2 years, maximum 3, according to some tapes. And well, I hope that, you know, one day we will have a Sasha Hein Academy. But anyway, maybe that's in the future program, as you're already contributing so much. Look, I have another question. Obviously, my first question comes from a documentary that I saw on BBC many years ago. I will pass it to you because it's so good, because it talks about research of a French group explaining that the understanding of color depends on the language and the culture. And they take it to the extreme of this tribe in Africa, where this tribe is unable to understand the difference between green and blue, because basically they use exactly the Himba, that's the name of the tribe. They use the same word. Probably you've seen it. It's a BBC program. So
it's well known. Yeah, the Himba tribe is well known, and it's not. So the Himba tribe is obviously very exotic, being in Africa, but you wouldn't think that. It's actually very similar in Russia. It's the same thing in Russia.
Yeah, we are. But I have to tell you, I noticed that also in my technicians in our laboratory, we have Matthias and we have Sebastian before, German. So it's more Caucasian type of color teeth they used to work with. And we work with Masami, Japanese, and Toro. Yeah. And the color, if I have to use a traditional system, a Vita pan, the Caucasian will come with the A and try to match to the A, and the Japanese will come with the B's and try to match to the B's. And I think it's a cultural point. So that's why my next question is really about the language of color, at least some fundamentals, what clinicians need to know. You know, normally we know value, chroma, hue, and that's how far we go. So is this enough to define a color of the tooth, or we need to enrich our vocabulary, understand more colors, and to be able to improve understanding and matching?
So, I mean, it's interesting. So the thing that you just mentioned about the Himba tribe is something that in color science we refer to as color language. So color language is pretty much what it says. It's the way that we name colors, that we describe colors and color differences, and we resort to expressions like warm colors and cool colors and things like this. And that's quite, you know, it's quite subjective, and of course it sort of lacks standardization, right? And this of course is not a new insight. It's not a new problem. It's been around for a very, very long time, you know. And the one of the most, not the first person, but one of the most notable people in the history of color science to take this on was Albert Henry Munsell, who you can see here. And Albert Henry Munsell was not a color scientist. He was an American painter. But he understood a thing or two about color language and color naming, right? And I guess recognized the inconsistencies and chaos that existed. And he wanted to find a better way of arranging colors in a more logically structured order for the purpose of improving color communication. Basically, that was the idea, right? So color wheels and things like that have been around for a long time, since the Middle Ages. Original ideas about color science and color theories come from the ancient Greeks. Okay, that's how far back it goes. But Munsell was certainly the person who put a first comprehensive color order system together like this. And this is basically how it works. So you have you've got a vertical axis there, which goes from 0 to 10 in 10 increments, right? Where 0 will be pitch black and 10 will be perfectly white, okay? And remains of this idea, of this concept, are still preserved in modern color models, by the way. They're still there, right? And then in a circular fashion around it, you have the many different hues that you find, the different colors, different hues that you find. And then on the center, in the center, you have the lowest chromaticity, and that chromaticity or saturation or color intensity increases as you go towards the periphery. And then you can see that these are certain steps apart. So when it says 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 and stuff, that's just the Munsell system has more discrete differentiation, okay? And the fundamental idea behind it was that the distance from one color to the next color is one perceivable color difference, okay? So colors don't blend into each other, but instead one color that goes to the next color is one visually perceivable distance, okay? And that is a feature of the Munsell system that still makes it very relevant today, okay? Because in color science, we use the Munsell system, the Munsell book of colors, which is a big thing, okay, with color chips in it, right? Physical standards. And we use those because they are uniformly spaced. Every color is one visual perceivable color difference away from the next, okay? Because they're visually uniform, more or less, we use them in computational color science to test how well color difference equations work.
The ability to perceive these steps different from person to person?
That's a very good question. That's a really good question. So how did they do that, right? Because color perception is subjective, right? And not every person will perceive color difference to the same distance steps. They won't, right? It's just there are natural variations in the human visual system, between individuals, among individuals, right?
So I have to say that comes from the notion that, person will see something like 11 different shades of gray. A dentist will see up to 22, but a radiologist will see up to 44. Yeah,
so the discrimination thresholds are different.
Training.
The perceptibility thresholds are different. And they would have done this with they would have come up with a system with very few observers, maybe even 1 or 2. That was not uncommon in the time, right? Correct. But don't forget, this goes back to 1910, okay? 1890, 1910. So it was the very beginning of color science. But still, for what it's worth, that sort of system holds up, and it does have its relevance in color science until today. Because if you come up with a new color difference equation, and the point of a good color difference equation is to predict color differences the way the human eye can perceive it, at least for the majority of people, the first thing you do is you test it computationally on the Munsell system to see if it produces equal color differences on the Munsell system, right? So it's still, until today, it's quite an achievement. And also until today, one of the most prominent color science institutes is located in Rochester, New York. It's the Munsell Institute, the X-Rite Munsell Institute. So that's the origin of it, right? They're still one of the best color institutes, besides Leeds, of course, that are active in this field of research. They're very good, very famous color science, like Roy Burns, and Mark Fairchild, the people that play professors that play dominant roles in color science. So this was like around 1910, right? This is when this sort of took shape, and then only a short time later, this gentleman here came along, and this is Edwin Bruce Clark, or E.B. Clark, as he would like to be called, okay? And he picked up the Munsell system with its structured order of hues, saturations, lightness, chromaticity, right? And filtered out a section of it that he thought would represent tooth color space, right? And this was in 1933, which is quite impressive. E.B. Clark was a very impressive person. He came up with a lot of interesting inventions that are totally normal today, like stump shades, for instance. E.B. Clark invented tri-in cement, okay, in the 1930s. And he came up with this E.B. Clark shade guide, which was a quite extensive shade guide, and it was built on the Munsell model, okay? That was certainly a very important milestone in dental colorimetry, if you want, in the 1930s. And so it went from the Munsell system into the tooth color space. That's where the connection comes from, right? And the thing that's even more amazing about this is that there's another researcher, which is Masamori, who's a Japanese researcher who developed the same ideas during the Second World War, okay, not knowing of Clark, right? And he also came up with a dental shade guide in 1968 that was based on the Munsell color system. The difference between the two, though, is, and that's also quite interesting, is that the Clark shade guide had tooth-shaped samples, much like a Vita shade guide. And you could hold them in someone's mouth for comparison, right? Massimo didn't have that. He literally had the book of Munsell colors, and there were paper chips. Okay, so these were teeth. Okay, so they thought about tooth color in a very two-dimensional way. What I mean with that is not in the term of colorimetry, but in terms of ignoring translucency and things like that. Although E.B. Clark had a better understanding of this, he realized that teeth are more translucent in the incisor region, but he related that to a Munsell color, you see. And then another figure in this field was Robert C. Sproul, who had done a lot of pioneering work in dental colorimetry together with the CIE and ASTM, which is an American organization to try and standardize tooth colors. And the same thing, it went on the premises and the foundation of the Munsell color system. So you can see like the Munsell color system is deeply rooted in dental colorimetry. It's the foundation of it for a very long time. It was then taken over by Lloyd Miller, who was a famous prosthodontist from the United States. I'm sure you've heard of him. Yes. And he tried to again relate the space and we call this the gamut, the range of natural tooth colors, the gamut of natural tooth colors. He tried to express and relate them using the Munsell system and the Munsell notation system again. And then the last one who did this was William O'Brien in 1997, also a professor from America, who basically tried to do the same thing clinically to allocate the color space of natural tooth colors in the Munsell system. And then finally, this sort of thing culminated in this product that we all know and love, which is the Vita 3D Master Shade Guide, which was launched only a few years later in 1998. And I've always heard, I don't know if this is true, but legend has it that this was developed by a dentist from Sydney. That's what I was told.
Well, I heard it was a dentist from Australia, but not from Sydney. I thought it was from Queensland. But
okay.
Yeah, well, obviously the legend is becoming bigger and bigger. But apparently, yes, it was an Australian guy. Surprisingly, nobody knows who he is. The name.
No. Very anonymous. I found research. I found no published papers, but I know that I read this. I read this somewhere that this Australian, I think it was a general practitioner, essentially took the Vita Classical Shade Guide and then added more colors to it, but based on the Munsell idea. So go left, go right, so shifting hues and shifting lightness and shifting chromaticity. So it was sort of inspired by that. And then this would eventually, lead to the 3D Master Shade Guide. Now, from the viewpoint of color science, from the perspective of color science, it is very important to understand that the Munsell system, right, and then consequently the Vita 3D Master Shade Guide system or any other shade guide in that matter, they are what we would call color ordering systems. Okay, they're designed as color order systems. They rank order, they order colors in following a specific logic. Okay, and the point I'm trying to make here is that the purposes of color order system is quite different. And this is something that E.B. Clark probably got wrong from the beginning, because he thought, well, can't we use a system to identify shades? To identify them, to color match. And that's a very important point, because this idea of using a color order system to identify, to match colors goes back to 1933. And it is still in the heads of the people today, okay? But this is not the purpose of a color order system, okay? The purpose of a color order system, here you can see many of them, is for subjective selection. Like what color do you want to dye your hair? You're not matching anything there. You're picking a color that you like. And the same is for makeup. What foundation do you choose for your skin? You're not color matching your skin. You're just choosing a foundation that you think fits best. It's subjective, right? One of the most prominent representatives of a color order system is the famous Pantone Shade Guide. You can see that here on the right-hand side. And again, the Pantone Shade Guide is not for color matching. The Pantone Shade Guide is used in the fashion and design industry to determine the colors of the season. And what makes it so valuable is that it comes with mixing recipes. It's reproducible. That's the point of the Pantone system. But the point is not to identify or match shades with it. That's not what it's for, you see. So one of the things that we have to be very, very careful with when we talk about tooth color is not to imagine tooth colors to be like solid colors, solid paints. That's what E.B. Clark did in 1933, and pretty much everyone who followed in his footsteps and had this idea that let's take a paint bucket that says A1 or A3 on it, and tooth color is only one element of what we would call tooth appearance. So there's a lot more to tooth appearance than just color. Tooth appearance is optics, translucency, anatomy, surface, texture, the relation to its surroundings, position in the arch. All of this is what contributes to tooth appearance. And color, in the terms of colorimetry, is just one aspect of that. But it doesn't describe the whole thing holistically. That's a very important thing to understand. So we shouldn't think of tooth colors the way that you can see here on the screen. That's a wrong way of thinking about tooth colors. Okay. And another problem with that is if we're trying to shade match, identify shades with shade guides, right, is what you can see here. So this is a statistic evaluation, or this is a 3D representation of 15,000 tooth colors that were measured in vivo. This is data that we have collected through our shape matching software over a period of 3 years. Okay, and this is plotted in the eLAB color space, in three-dimensional color space, where the vertical axis is lightness, and then you have a red-green axis, and you have a yellow-blue axis there. So in 3D space, all those dots that you can see here are someone's tooth color, 15,000 of them, and they're plotted in real eLAB colors. And then in circles here, in those red dots, these are the coordinates of the Vita classical shade guide, the current version that they sell, right? And in cyan, or in green, the green circles here, these are the color coordinates of the 3D master shade guide. So you can see, like, where you have the density of a splatterless plot, where you have the density of those points is where your statistic likelihood is high that your target color is going to be. And you can see it's impossible to shade match that with a shade guide. Because
this is outstanding.
The range of available colors isn't enough to cover this quite large gamut of natural tooth colors. You can't do it, right? And so we wanted to work this out mathematically based on this gamut. We wanted to know, if you use this shade guide, which is still the world standard, the gold standard today, right? What is your chance of actually color matching with the shade guide? If you compare it, if you take the coordinates and you run it against the database of 15,000 tooth colors, and these are the results. Yeah. So in less than 1% of all cases would it be possible to select a shade that is visually imperceptible from the target color. And in less than 3% of all cases, it would be clinically acceptable. And in 97% of the cases, it wouldn't be clinically acceptable, or be much worse than that. And this is what we call coverage error, okay? And we also ran this data against the coordinates of the 3D master shade guide. And I guess there's two ways of looking at it. You could say, well, it performs twice as good as the Vita classical shade guide. You could say that. But still, the way that we would probably say it in England is, your chances of color matching with a shade guide is vanishingly small. Okay. Yeah. And I am an adamant believer that you can't shade match with shade guides. I think this is hit and miss. You need some sort of color measurement system and a recipe system for sure. Another prevailing problem that we have with this system is that there's no standard for it. That's another issue with it, right? Like everybody that listens to this podcast will know what an A3 is, because we deal with A3s every day. Everybody knows what an A3 is. Intuitively, everybody knows that, right? But it is quite interesting to realize that an A3 doesn't actually exist. It doesn't exist because the reason it doesn't exist is because there is no ISO standard for it. So nobody ever said, we call an A3 an A3 if you take a tooth-colored sample with a thickness of 1 millimeter and you measure its reflectance with this geometry, and if the values are this, this, and this, then we call it an A3. No such standard exists, right? It doesn't exist. And so what you're looking at here is these are all specimens of dental materials that are all labeled A3. And you don't have to be a color scientist to notice that they look markedly different. And this problem is not only restricted to indirect materials like ceramics. You'll have the same problem with direct composites. And from the papers that I know, they point even at the direction that direct composites have much more color variation, much more differences of identity labeled shades. And so these are the problems with the way that we communicate color in dentistry, and particularly if you want to use it for the purpose of shade matching. I think using shade guides in our communication in dentistry is adequate if you want to use it for shade selection. as in your patient wants 6 veneers, 6 crowns from K9 and K9, you know, you're not going to color match the lower anteriors, are you? Unlikely. You'll sit down with them, you have a chat, and you ask them, hey, do you want them in A1? Do you want them in B1? Or do you want them lighter, right? So this is the original intention of a color order system. It's subjective. If you pick which color you want to dye your hair, you pick your tooth color, you can do that. But that's not the same as shade matching. That's a very, very different thing altogether.
Very, very important point, Sasha. And yes, you're right. When we work with composite, you really can't trust what's written on the tube. You really need to try directly on the tooth, and even pre-made samples, different thicknesses. Yeah, much more dramatic than ceramics. And it's true. The attitude with patients now is, what color would you like when we do the full mouth? But it's very different when you have to try to match a central incisor or just any anterior teeth. And we in the laboratory don't accept to have any order like central incisor color A2. We always tell it that 90% is not going to match. We need more information. So we ask a patient to come to the laboratory and take the color. But let's get a little bit deeper into materials. So obviously zirconia now and lithium disilicate are dominating the market. And in terms of core material, and then you layer on top of that. But who loves lithium disilicate will say that zirconia lacks of fluorescence, and that affects color perception of ceramic, of the crown. So over time, the dental ceramic manufacturer have tried to compensate the lack of fluorescence by adding fluorescence particles into layering and glazing porcelain. I saw one of your paper in 2018. You show that fluorescence doesn't affect brightness of ceramics under natural sunlight, and therefore it's very unlikely to affect the perception of color in general. That was 2018, has been 6 years. Have you changed your mind, or you think that fluorescence is not really important?
So fluorescence is one of the features of the optical properties of dental hard tissues, and as such, it is important, right? And we should probably copy it, okay? I totally agree with that. But yeah, let me tell you how this all came about, because there's this in the industry, especially among dental technicians, there's this conspiracy. Okay, there's this relation between fluorescence and metamerism and aesthetic, natural, bright tooth colors and that kind of thing, right? And I mean, there's a plethora of published papers in popular science, that go on about the importance of fluorescence. And it's like some people have explained it as an underground effect, right? And it has received, the stamp of a hallmark of aesthetic quality, right? And this is when the manufacturers went bonkers, and they made the products even more fluorescent, to the point where they have super fluorescent. So there was a paper by a research team published out of Tübingen University, which is in our neighborhood, Christian Mellers, and they analyzed the fluorescence emission of direct composites, and they found that some of these had a fluorescence emission that was 10 times stronger than that of natural dentition. Okay,
yes.
So like if you tell the industry this is good, then the conclusion is then much more of it must be much more better, right? So the way that this basically works, that the fundamental principle of fluorescence is that you need to have molecules that are able to be fluorescent in the first place. Okay, they have to be unstable enough to be fluorescent in the first place, right? And then what you need is an excitation wavelength, which is a form of energy, right? And say ultraviolet energy is a quite strong energy. Like in severe quantities, it can give us skin cancer, especially in a place like Australia, right? So ultraviolet radiation has fairly energetic form of radiation of energy, and it now encounters a fluorescent molecule, fluorescent atom material that is fluorescent. And so what it does is, as it arrives, you can see that here, it'll collide with one of the electrons, and it will knock it out of its orbit. Boom. And now the electron is in an orbit where it doesn't belong, okay? And that's an unnatural state. And as soon as the energy ceases in a very, very short time interval, right, that electron is going to jump back to its ground state. It's going to return to where it came from. And in doing so, it releases a visible photon. So it takes the energy that it previously picked up, it jumps back to its ground state, and it releases the energy in the form of a visible photon of a different wavelength. That's what fluorescence is, okay? And in the case of the UV-induced fluorescence, which is the strongest type of fluorescence we have in natural teeth, that's a quite dramatic effect because ultraviolet radiation is invisible to the human eye. The maximum, the ideal excitation wavelength is about 365 nanometers. We can't see that, right? And the emission that you get is about 420 nanometers. So when you in the nightclub, you get this nice blue, bright glow of teeth. This is the re-emitted energy in the form of a photon with a maximum emission of about 420 nanometers. Okay. What a lot of people don't know is that there are about 3 or 4 different types of fluorescences in teeth, not just one. It's just that the ultraviolet fluorescence is the strongest. But we also have fluorescence in the blue, in the green, and in the infrared. And they use fluorescence as well for caries detection. Okay, so it has diagnostic purposes as well. So this is the thing about fluorescence, really. Okay. Now, when you look at the history of fluorescence and aesthetics and dentistry and stuff, there are a few papers that were published like in the 60s and 70s, McCullum, Panzeret, people like that. And they were very, very shy about suggesting what fluorescence does, very, very careful about this until this paper came along. And this paper was published by a team of French researchers. This was Gérard Monsenego. He was at Paris University in 1993. And the main thing about this paper was, at that time in the early 90s, lasers became affordable and more compact. And you can use lasers for fluorimetry. So you can excite a fluorescent object with a laser with a discrete wavelength and see what emission you get. And that was the technology that they had at the time. So the main purpose of this paper really was to assess the fluorescence of dental porcelains using lasers. And as such, it's not a bad paper, but here's the thing, okay? In the introduction, it says, in 1911, Strudel, that wasn't his name was Strubel, he was German, showed that natural teeth emit a strong blue fluorescence under the action of ultraviolet beams. And now it comes, and then he says, this property makes them whiter and brighter in daylight. It is this fluorescence which seems to come from inside that gives the natural tooth its living aspect according to Clark. Okay, 1, Clark never said that, and 2, the citation that is provided there is incorrect. So it took me about a year to chase this citation up, and it is a book in French language that was at the library at the dental school in Paris that a friend of mine got, and it doesn't talk about fluorescence at all, okay? It talks about clinical aspects of polishing restorations. But the point is he got that sentence published in the Journal of Prosthetic Dentistry, and with that, he unleashed Pandora's box.
That's
so
very sad.
Everybody who went on about fluorescence and how important it makes teeth white and bright in sunlight, they quoted Monsenego. And there was never any evidence for it. None whatsoever, right?
Wow.
So I set out to investigate this with my former professor, Jaap ten Bosch, who is a physicist, called himself a dental physicist. He's in his late 80s now, and he was at Groningen University in the Netherlands. And they published a really good paper with Dr. Koopes in 1997, which talked about optical properties and mechanical properties of human hard tissues. And they also tested this fluorescence thing. And what they did is they irradiated, they illuminated the teeth with halogen light bulbs, right? And in halogen light is no UV, none. And they measured the tooth color with halogen, and they measured it again with xenon light. And xenon light is a daylight simulator. It's got a lot of UV in it, okay? And they realized that there was no color difference between both conditions. If fluorescence really mattered, then under the xenon light, it should be brighter and whiter than under the halogen light, but it wasn't, okay? But there was only like a small hint in there that this may not be true. So I wanted to test this, and I talked to the guys from Creation at the time, and I asked them, can you make me a ceramic that has no fluorescence in it? Can you do that? And he says, yeah, we can do that, sure. And then they made me an A1 Creation dentin with no fluorescence, because the fluorescence is added later, right? It had very little to no fluorescence. And then I made 2 crowns on the left, on the right. So one was a standard A1, the commercial product, with fluorescence in it, right? And the other one was the A1 batch that they made for me with no fluorescence. And I swear to God, we tried to measure these crowns under different light conditions, inside, outside, went out on the street in Perth and, in summer and wanted to see if one of them would go noticeably brighter and whiter than the other, and nothing ever happened, right? And this then led to the research that was published in Dental Materials that you just mentioned in 2018. Okay, so we wanted to test this, and we did it with 35 extracted human teeth, and I measured them in my backyard in Perth over a couple of weekends in the height of summer, and it gets pretty hot in Perth in summer, I can tell you that. I got sunburned doing it. And we basically measured them with a spectrometer in broad Perth sunlight, just for the sun hitting it, taking a reflectance measurement. And I built a box for it. And then with the second round of measurements, we placed a thick sheet of polycarbonate over the box, and polycarbonate blocks the UV, and measured the color again. And sure enough, the color difference was not perceivable between them. So the conclusion of our study was that the UV-induced fluorescence of natural teeth did not influence tooth color under normal daylight conditions. Now, that was a bit of a bombshell in certain industries at the time. I remember I was considered a heretic for mentioning this on stage, because it destroyed a lot of, I guess, emotional sort of illusions about the role and relevance of fluorescence, and making restorations look more lifelike and that kind of thing. And there are reasons for this, but they don't relate to fluorescence. But then as time moved on, something quite interesting has happened, and this is that a couple of years ago, or 10 years ago, the European Union had passed a new legislation that effectively banned the use of fluorescent tubing in the European Union, because fluorescent tubing contains mercury, and it's not particularly energy efficient, right? And this ban came in place last year in August. But the industry has adjusted for this upcoming restrictions, upcoming ban many years before that, okay? And so what happened as a consequence of that is all the fluorescent tubing already had started to disappear in industrial applications, industrial lighting applications, and they were gradually replaced with LEDs, which are more energy efficient, right? Yeah. And that meant the black light tubing that we know and love from our childhood in the 1970s and 80s in the nightclubs have disappeared as well. And they were replaced with LEDs. Now, these LEDs don't emit ultraviolet radiation. They don't. Their emission is blue light, 405 nanometers, a very, very discrete peak emission, okay? And when you excite teeth with 405 nanometers, you get a whitish, greenish fluorescence. But when you do this with indirect restorations, you get nothing. So all the indirect restorations that we have today, the materials for indirect restorations, zirconium dioxide, dental ceramics, lithium disilicate, anything, you name it, anything that comes out of the lab, ceramic materials, have no fluorophores that respond to 405 nanometers. On the other hand, though, the direct composite materials that you use, they respond quite heavily to this type of excitation. So you've got this bizarre situation where somebody could have an anterior direct composite restoration, which is really going to glow. That's going to be really, really bright in the nightclub. And then they could have a metal ceramic restoration, Emax crown, a zirconia crown next to it, and be totally black. Okay, so this is the problem that we have today. So I always have to I always smile a little bit when I see presenters getting on stage and showing the blue fluorescent pictures with the UV and stuff, and mentioning how important this is for perceived aesthetics under normal light conditions, which it isn't. And really, if you have a problem with fluorescence in the nightclub, it would be like the picture on the right, where pretty much all of our indirect restorations now look absolutely black. And I've spoken to a couple of the manufacturers here in Europe, because they're, in the general proximity where I live, and they say, yeah, we haven't got anything. Nothing that we have responds to 405 nanometers. And that's where we are today.
Very, very interesting. I have to say my knowledge on color, science of color, compared to yours is very superficial. And you're right that in my mind, there was maybe that damn article that said that fluorescence is very important. And it seemed to me very logical to me, because, if you just follow basic principle, not explained by you, you would think that fluorescence is important. And then I actually bumped into an article, because also in my mind there was zirconia is very inert chemically, so it's not fluorescence. But EMEX, lithium disilicate, is much more active from a chemical composition. But also I found this article showing that there's lots of, according to the type of ingot that you use, some of lithium disilicates are not fluorescence at all, but very little. So some a little bit more. And I started having doubts. And then when I found your article, I said, oh, here we are. So from that perspective, is there any point in measuring, taking photographs of fluorescent teeth when you're doing your restorations? No, really?
No, I don't think so. No, this is a bit like, when we talk about the often futile attempts of coming up with shape matching protocols, in the books, on stage over the last 25 years, 30 years. I'm sure you've seen them. I've seen them as well. So, what is the advice that has been issued, right? Take pictures of the teeth from different angles, right? When you take the shape, expose them to different light conditions and different parts of the room and this and that and stuff, I guess that's practical, and it certainly is well intended, but not very helpful, to be honest, okay? If you do all of that, what you do is you document that the teeth have varying appearances depending on how you expose them, right? Now, what are you going to do with that? There is on protocol that says if A is B, then C. It doesn't exist. This is just meaningless information, to be honest, right? And that's a bit like the fluorescence thing as well. Fluorescence is interesting for the study in forensics, for instance. They've used it in forensic for a very long time until today. It is interesting from the viewpoint of diagnostics. Caries detections, the porphyrins of caries, which are the metabolic byproducts of caries, fluoresce red, have a reddish fluorescence. You can detect it that way. But a lot of other stuff fluoresces red as well, although it's not caries. It's used in oncology during surgery. So it fluoresces green under the excitation with UV light and things like this. It has relevance there. It has relevance, I guess, if you want to remove residual restorations. There are two schools of thoughts on this. Being a prosthodontist, you know this way better than me. As far as I know, there's those who say if there are residual restorations, you're going to get rid of them before you put something new on there. And then there's the other school of thought that says, no, you can leave it, just prep around it, and just make another restoration over it. Whatever floats your boat. But it's not so easy to detect a residual composite restoration without fluorescence. And I think that's the reason why manufacturers like Zeiss have incorporated this into their microscopes, because it makes it easier to detect. Yeah. So it has applications like that.
Quite interesting, I have to say. Talking about applications and materials again, I have a feeling that years ago, my PhD was on mechanical properties. That's where I was in. And in 2000, zirconia came, and late 90s, and that's where I was studying. And it didn't take me long to understand that what it was Empress 2 at that time was really ideal as a monolithic material or minimally layer at that time. And it took a little bit of time to talk to Avocla. They really wanted to use the material for bridges. And then they understood that the market was really single units. And they developed, variety of shades and EMEX, as we know, just to talk about materials and so on. So then obviously the market became less layer and more monolithic progressively. But then I can see now that there's a bit of going back to sophisticated staining, at least, or just minimal layering. It looks like that duplicating or replicating aesthetics with monolithic, despite ultra-translucent, super translucent zirconia, the cost in terms of mechanical property to me is significant, because this material becomes weaker and weaker. And when they become so weak, at that point, I think a well-supported porcelain gives you such a much better aesthetic outcome and almost the same mechanical properties in some way, in particularly anteriorly, obviously. So do you want to make a comment on this and how that fits into your project, that So basically from layer to monolithic, and now we're going back in terms of general market to minimal layering and staining, sophisticated staining, not just simple.
Yeah, that's right. So, you know, I know these debates and the viewpoints from the ceramists, from the dental clinicians, because I'm a dental ceramist as well, right? And you know, we were trained and grew up with layering ceramics, stacking different layers of ceramic, polychromatic layering, you know, done hundreds of courses on this. You know, it's the beating heart of dental ceramics, right? But today, as a color scientist, you know, I look at these objects more in terms of their optical properties, and what makes color in a tooth and what makes color in a restoration is a ratio of the scattering and the absorption coefficient. That's really all it is. These are the two things that dictate the appearance for a large part in these restorations. And I think because there's been a fair bit of suspicion against these monolithic stain restorations within the community where we used to layer ceramics and that kind of thing, right? This was accompanied by a certain stigma whereby it was believed that layered restorations are more naturally looking, and also this whole fluorescence thing, because, you know, a lot of these monolithic materials, as you mentioned, have a very varying unintended fluorescence regime, like you said about lithium disilicate, right? And that's totally true. So the fluorescence emission that you get from lithium disilicate materials, if you excite it with ultraviolet radiation, is unintentional. It's a side effect. That's why some of them fluoresce, others don't. Yeah. Like MO0 fluoresces quite strongly, MO2 not at all. It's black, right? Yeah. Another one has a really greenish fluorescence. That's not the intention, right? It's a side effect. It relates to the chemistry of it. It would be oxygen defects in the network, something like that. It's unintentional. Yeah. And so they sell these products that you apply to the zirconia to give it fluorescence and give it this property and stuff. And so when people thought about, well, why is the fluorescence thing so important and stuff, it was related to metamerism. It's basically said that if you have a crown that lacks fluorescence, and ultimately that's monolithic materials, well, then it must be metameric. And if it's metameric, well, that means it can't be as nice, it can't be as aesthetic as a layered restoration, right? So this was another claim that I investigated. And, you know, I like to look at the history of things. I want to know where stuff came from, right? And metamerism has been debated in the dental literature for a very, very long time. And this one is a quite, you know, strong statement made by Robert Sproul in 1973, and he described it as a monster, okay? Said metamerism is a monster in color matching, that it can cause seemingly accurate color match to disappear when the conditions under which the original match was obtained are changed, okay? So what he's basically saying here is he's made the observation that under some viewing conditions, a crown and a tooth may match quite well, but not when you change those viewing conditions. And this is what they call metamerism. And MacLean had a more, you know, distinct answer to this, or more distinct view on this. Is that pairs of ceramic materials containing similar metallic pigments will be only slightly metameric, whereas ceramic made to match the color of teeth can be highly metameric, since the spectral characteristics of the two materials are very different. So what he's saying is basically that the metamerism has its origin in the difference in the pigmentation, okay? And this causes this breakdown of a color match, and this is then led on to others to believe that this is the late Makoto Yamamoto with his still fantastic book until today. And I don't mean to discredit any of these people. I have the highest respect for them. This is just in scientific interest, in the name of scientific interest. And it was Yamamoto who said that in fact metamerism occurs more frequently than expected. It is one of the most common reasons for disharmony of shades in ceramic-metallic prosthesis. And he also argued that the pigmentation, the natural coloring that we find in dental hard tissues cannot be the same as the artificial coloring that we find in materials, and that metamerism must be an unavoidable consequence of all of this, right? But much like the fluorescence myth, these were just expressions of opinions. It was never actually tested. Nobody ever tested that. It just sounded plausible, and it was adopted from other industries where metamerism is in fact a problem. It's a problem in the print industry. It's a problem in the textile industry. It's well documented, right? So they saw this, oh, this is a problem in another industry. It must be a problem in our industry as well, right? And they linked it to this observation that sometimes crowns match better than other times, right? So what metamerism basically means is that two stimuli can present as a close color matched when irradiated with a particular color temperature, light source with a particular color temperature, but not when you change that color temperature. And this is what these light indicator metamerism strips do. So this is like a paper strip. It comes from a company around the corner from us in Basel in Switzerland. This is like an institute in Switzerland for print. And you can place this strip under your light in your office. And if that office light has a color temperature of D50, you're looking at a more or less uniform green bar, right? And if the spectral power distribution of the light source that you're using doesn't have a color temperature of D50, it has something grossly different, then you can see different boxes, okay? That's an example of metamerism. The truth is, to get such an appreciable metameric effect, you really have to do some serious engineering. This is not something you will typically encounter in nature. This is really, really rare, okay? You have to invest a lot of time and effort to make two stimuli, to make two paints that can do that, okay? And what this is often, and this is where the link is, okay? This is where the link between fluorescence and metamerism is, okay? This is another picture, a clinical case that Javier Tapia has provided. And you can see on the left and on the right, this is the same lateral incisor restoration, right? And you can also see, just by looking at the images, that the color temperatures are not the same. So the color temperature on the image on the left that was set on the camera is slightly different because it was probably set to automatic white balance. It's slightly different than the color temperature that is set on the right, okay? And you can see that as far as lightness is concerned, right? The lateral on the image on the left looks better matching than the one on the right. On the right, it looks brighter. So what's the cause of this? I mean, the mechanism would be metamerism, and it's very tempting to argue, well, clearly that's a fluorescence thing, right? And the fact is that it really has neither to do with that. The reasons for these kinds of mismatches is a very different one. And this is another case that I did with a friend of mine. He's a prosthodontist in Lisbon, in Portugal. This is an eLAB case that we did over the distance. And what you can see on those two images is the same crown, photographed with the same flash, same camera, same white balance, one after the other. And the only difference between the two images is that on the left, you have a more or less full-fledged smile, right? So the teeth are exposed to light. And on the right-hand side, the lip drops down. And as the lip drops down, you can see that the crown sort of seems to become opaque, becomes bright, whereas the tooth sort of darkens down. Now, it's very tempting to think that this has something to do with fluorescence or, you know, metamerism, but consider that the spectral composition of the light source hasn't changed because it's the same flash. We're not switching different color temperatures. It's the same color temperature. That hasn't changed, right? And what we know today, what the cause of this complication is that a discrete combination of the scattering and the absorption coefficient, when you join them, is what makes the color of a translucent object like a tooth. But the scattering and absorption coefficient are independent of each other. You can influence one without influencing the other, okay? And when we measure tooth color, we only measure the consequence of an unknown combination of scattering and absorption. So you have this type of complication when the color matches under the condition under which the color was measured, right? And it doesn't match under a different condition because the combination of the scattering and the absorption coefficient is not the same as the one in the tooth. And so when you vary the illumination conditions and stuff, you know, the tooth will respond to it differently in this particular case because the scattering coefficient is most likely lower than the scattering coefficient is in the crown that we've made. Now, the problem is right now, we don't have any means of measuring this in the mouth. The only thing that we can measure is the consequence, which is the color of the tooth under the prescribed conditions. And we can make a color match under those prescribed conditions. But when we change those prescribed conditions to different illumination geometries, then the color match may fall apart. But this has nothing to do with fluorescence. It's not a lack or excess of fluorescence, right? And it doesn't relate, as it turns out, to metamerism in the classic sense. This was a paper that I published last year. This was, I've mentioned my PhD transfer Viva at the end of my first year at Leeds University. This was the paper that I published based on my research project. my first research project. And the question that we tried to answer here was, are monolithic zirconia restorations, multi-layered zirconia restorations, which is pretty much what everybody's doing nowadays, right? Are they more metameric than the hand-layered crowns? That's what we wanted to know. And we compared them with 104 extracted human teeth. It's maybe a quite complicated paper. It comes from the area of color science, but the conclusion of the paper was that the monolithic restorations are not more metameric than the layered restorations were, or to be more precise, in both cases, it didn't matter. The incidences of metamerism were very weak, and it's not anything that you would observe with the eye. Now, one thing that has to be said, though, in this regard is that, does that mean that we can switch completely to monolithic stain restorations for all applications, right? Including single center or anterior shape matching? And I would say probably not. Probably doesn't matter if you do multiples, smile makeover cases from K9 to K9, from premolar to premolar, probably not, right? But when it comes to shape matching single anterior restorations, there may be a few cases where you can do this with a staining technique, but I would argue in the majority of cases, you will still have to layer the crown. That's my take on things.
I can only agree with that. It's so much more aesthetically pleasant when you layer. And that's why I can see that color matching has been, you see, we probably, Sasha, you're aware that we opened the laboratory in 2011. And before then, I was working with local technicians, and there are some technicians are absolutely amazing in Sydney. But, I think the main problem was the lack of resources. Each technician, you have a single individual ceramist and working, 14 hours a day, exhausted, with not the right equipment, because there's not much money in the laboratory. So we opened the laboratory with the intention to be able to have a bit more resources in the laboratory. We team up with other people, and so that we can possibly focus on quality work. To me, color matching anterior without limitation in time or materials is crucial, is where I build up my reputation, like all my other prosthodontist colleagues in Sydney. I think the level is pretty even. So that's why I've always been interested in color match. And in the past, we use any technique, calibrated photograph with great cards, Photoshop. I remember following a online course from Eddie McLaren, how to calibrate photographs with Photoshop, probably 7 hours, I can't remember exactly. So, and we moved back to the lab, and I found the systems very laborious and not always accurate. And then finally, your application came, which was initially based on Lightroom. I remember that. I still have slides when I was giving some lectures on how we match colors. And then finally, your application came. So we don't need Lightroom anymore, which I was quite happy about that. And all of the other problems I had with the other system were just overcome, disappear. And we didn't obviously go back to any Photoshop or any store, just use your application. So I have a series of questions here. I just want to know, how come that you manage, even with Lightroom, you basically are still traditional in some way. You still using Photoshop, you're still using Lightroom. So then you develop your application, but even when it was only Lightroom, it became pretty reliable immediately, and then became much more accurate, but still a very high level, as I told you at the beginning of this video podcast. So our match is more than 90%. So my first question on your system is, what's the difference between what you develop and it was already working with Lightroom, and why the other system is so complicated and I just couldn't really match in the same way? Then a few more questions here. So then I'll let you talk because it's all about your system. So when you were working in Perth, I didn't have the opportunity to work with you, mainly because I think in my mind is we're located in Sydney, you're in Perth, you know, we still need to see the patient, perhaps. And I think that the distance will be a limitation. So I think that technicians that can see the patient have a bit of an edge. It's easier to do some work. But in reality, again, this is not happening anymore. So we have a laboratory, one around the corner from my practice, which is our laboratory. We opened another one in Sussex Street, and where Matthias is located. And I work with Matthias on a daily basis, and he doesn't see the patient. And we don't have this problem. So again, the only burden on my side is I have to take a set of photographs. But in reality, your technique is very simple. It's 4 photographs, if I remember properly. And so in this way, I can actually have a conversation with the technician. This is what you need. I just need to follow your protocol, which is very simple. But again, some dentists think that when I talk to them, when I explain the protocol, they think it's a bit daunting. Is the equipment, they want to use a telephone, for example. They don't want to have the investment of just an SLR with a good lens, with a good flash, and a polarized filter. That's all you need. So the question for you is just clarify how many photographs we need, the type of equipment, and how crucial it is for your technique. And I think I will have another question about polarizing filter. Maybe we leave that after. So you want to try to explain photography, the role, and how you progress it, that you made your technique so reliable, even when it was not an application, but just for use of Lightroom.
Yeah, so over the years, a lot of people have claimed that they have sort of invented the use of a gray reference card for the purpose of dental photography and quantifying tooth colors, right? To the best of my knowledge, the original idea goes back to a patent that was filed in 2005 by Wolfgang Bengel, who was a famous German dentist around not far from where we live here, and he published these books on dental photography. He's been capacity in the field of dental photography for some 20, 30 years until he died, passed away, you know, way too soon. And the co-author was, I think, Stephen Chu from New York. So they published this patent in 2005, and it says the digital image is taken with a predetermined neutral reference adjacent object. A commercially available image editing software is used to standardize and analyze the color information of the digital image based on the neutral reference. So when you saw Ed McLaren's presentation, it would have involved using a wide bell gray reference card and the workflow in Photoshop and that. But the limitation of that was it would only work for this one camera. Which in Ed's case makes perfect sense, because Ed is not just a prosthodontist, he's also a fine dental ceramist, right? So everything is in one hand. So he has this one camera, he takes the photos of it, he had the wide bell gray reference card, and then he would probably be the person who makes the restoration as well. But where this didn't work was when you combine different cameras with each other. That's when it didn't work, right? And the process was fairly laborious. So the digital color sensor was invented by Kodak, ironically, in the 1970s. And as soon as they had the digital sensor invented, they were looking at a specific application that we know of in color science called spectral data recovery. And that is, can you recover the spectral data from a camera sensor, right? And the way you go about it is you characterize the sensor with a color checker, okay? Something like this here. So this is the color checker for the webcam that I'm using right now, okay? And so by having knowledge of these color patches, knowing the XYZ color coordinates of each color patch, and then knowing how the camera measures it, you can do what we call spectral data recovery. And this is how old the idea is. So I've added a few bits and pieces to this workflow. One was, this is called global characterization. So you take a picture of a color checker, and then you estimate the spectral sensitivity response from the sensor, right? And this enables you to synchronize different cameras more or less with each other. That was the Lightroom workflow, which needed different camera profiles for every single camera. So you couldn't use a camera for this protocol in Lightroom unless we had characterized the sensor, you see. But that was a major thing that I added to the protocol that made it more reliable and robust, and you could use it with different cameras. And the second thing is that Panos had come up with Polarize around that time as well. So we're talking about, I was still in Perth 2010, right about that, right? 13 years ago, 14 years ago, something like that. And the original idea of cross-polarization was actually first published by two general practitioners from England, Peter Gordon and Phil Wonder, and they published this book in 1987, which is not very well known, which is a shame. It's a really, really good book. I quite very much enjoy it. And in this book, they were the first ones to use cross-polarization for dental photography. And they used the Olympus system. So Olympus had a ring flash with a cross-polarizer you could screw into the ring flash. Quite neat.
Wow.
And they photographed it. They photographed it and photographed the teeth, and says upper anterior teeth photographed normally, that is reflected. And the same you photograph using the Olympus cross-polarizing filter. I guess at the time you talk about film photography, you know, they didn't see the potential of this, right? To the best of my knowledge, the next person who published about using cross-polarization for the purpose of making direct composite restorations in a journal that no longer exists, it used to be called PPAD, was Lorenzo Vanini.
Oh, yes, I know Vanini very well.
He realized the potential of it, but he didn't explain how he did it.
Yeah.
Okay. And he probably got it from this book. So cross-polarization is, of course, a very important thing, and I'll explain in a minute why it is important. But this is basically, you know, I took existing elements and rearranged them, connected them in a new way, which would then eventually morph into what we call the eLAB system today. So this is the seminal work that I published on this protocol that shows the progression of how one thing sort of came to the next. And what was important for this color measurement system from the beginning was because we had a background in dental photography, right? And we wanted to have a color measurement system that is centered around dental photography. And the only other way you could do it is with a spectrometer. Something like a Vita Easy Shade, all those devices that were launched in the early 2000s, most of which have vanished and disappeared, right? Most of them no longer exist for various reasons. And those reasons are not inaccuracy. It's not that these devices lacked accuracy. And in color science, we have very, very definitive ideas what accuracy means and what it doesn't mean. And they don't match the ideas in dentistry, I can tell you that, okay? But the problem was more that, you know, we realized that you can't use classical shades to shade match. We had to have a more drastic approach. But to begin with, we thought that by that time, dental photography had arrived in pretty much every practice in most dental labs. So they had the equipment that was needed to take photos of teeth. So that's a digital camera body by the time they become very affordable, a digital macro lens, and a flash system that is suitable for dental photography, either a lateral flash or ring flash. When I started out with this, you know, 14 years ago, I was an adamant supporter and proponent of using the lateral flash because it's great for reflected images. But in reality, it's a source of error because this protocol is very standardized, and it's important that everything is always done in the same way. And the sort of flexibility that a lateral flash gives you, it really is a source of error. The fact that, you know, one flash could point inwards more than the other will create an appearance of the tooth that the lab can't reproduce unless they do the same thing. Okay, so today, when people ask me, you know, what do you need for eLAB, I'd say use a ring flash. Because if you're a dental practitioner, the chances are you probably already have one, and they're fine, they're easy to use, right? And then, in combination with your flash, you need the matching polarized filter, the cross-polarization filter. And what it does is this. It takes a reflected image like this, and it removes the surface glare. And now the reason you would do that, the reason why you want to remove the surface glare is because you want to measure color. And you can't measure color if there's surface reflections on the teeth. You have to remove them. So you're measuring the color of the teeth. Now, over the years, many people have asked me, well, you know, do I have to spend the money on buying the original polarized filter? And you know, my advice is yes, you should, because this has been thoroughly tested and we have built the eLAB system around it. I have had the opportunity to, you know, I've come across a lot of copycat systems over the last couple of years. And in principle, they provide cross-polarization, but they shift the color temperature at the same time. So these polarizing filter sheets come in different quality levels and quality grades. And there's an easy way to figure out what sort of quality level it is, and that is if you hold one filter over the other filter in a crossed position and you hold it against the light source, it should go completely black. That's called the extinction ratio. It needs to be a thick laminate with a high extinction ratio. If it goes orange or yellow or blue, it's not suitable. And sometimes I've seen, copy polarized filters that had little holes in them, but you could only see it when you held it against the light. So my advice is I don't spend the money and the time to buy all these copycat systems and to see if they will work with eLAB. I don't. We've built this system around the polarized filter, and we know it works with that. Now, the one thing you have to remember, though, when you use cross-polarization is that 50% of the light, half of it, is actually wasted. So half of the light that is triggered when you push the exposure button, right, the shutter button, is either reflected backwards or it's converted to heat, right? And that lies in the process of cross-polarization. So only one phase of the light is being allowed to permit through the filter, and only this one phase comes back to the lens, right? So the reason I'm saying this is important is because you can't use cross-polarization with TTL, because your camera doesn't know what you're trying to do. It doesn't even know what polarize is. And if your camera flash is set to TTL, then the lens decides, the camera decides how much flash to use. And then typically, when you use polarize, you end up with very underexposed images, and they may not be useful or may not be suitable. So when using cross-polarization, it's important to switch to the manual mode instead. Just press the mode button once, and it goes to M, and then make sure that you use the maximum flash output, because half of this is going to be wasted, right? So in order to get a decent exposure. And no matter what camera you use, we use standardized settings. Your camera should always be set to a shutter speed of 125th of a second and an aperture of 22 and an ISO of 100. And very important, in order to synchronize different cameras with each other. Say when you take the camera in your practice with your camera, right? And then you send it to Matthias in Sussex Street, he probably has a different camera, different Nikon model, different Canon model. Okay, so they're not going to be the same camera. And so with the eLAB system, we can synchronize those images, but only if they are RAWs. We can't do it with JPEGs, because only with a RAW image can we apply the mathematical calculations, the matrices, to synchronize both cameras with each other. And then you ask me, how many pictures do you need? I mean, that's pretty much all you need. Use retractors, always a good idea to use retractors. And when you do, tell them to pull the patient up and towards the ears and move the mandible forward into an edge-to-edge position, and tell them to remove the tongue. And then in this position, you place the gray reference card, and then you take a photo. And nowadays, I think you really only need one photo, and that's the cross-polarized image. You will probably help your lab if you provide a reflected image as well, just because they get an idea of the surface texture and that kind of thing. That's an interesting information for the lab to have. And above all, and that's most of the time underestimated, is you should provide a photograph of the preparation of the substrate. That's something that's very easy to forget in the everyday, because often we don't think about the fact that, think of the life cycle of a tooth. How many times will you make a single center restoration on a pulp that's still vital? Not very often. Most of the time it has a posting core or something in it. When it's got a posting core or something in it, there's usually some kind of discoloration. And this discoloration needs to be communicated to the dental lab. Because nowadays, for the most part, we work with all ceramic materials, and they are translucent media. They will respond to a discolored substrate. And this is an important information the lab needs to have, right? We shouldn't forget about that. And the other thing we need to look out for is dehydration. So don't document the shade at a moment in time when you have nothing better to do, like when you pack the port and you're waiting for the hemostatic agent to work, because by that time, the patient had the mouth open for 20, 30 minutes at least, and the teeth are dehydrated. So you should take the image before treatment or well after treatment, but not during treatment. And then this raw image can then be sent to your dental lab, in your case, Matthias in Sussex Street. He has the eLAB Prime software, and he can upload the image into the eLAB Prime software. It does the calibration automatically. So this replaces the workflow in Lightroom. It measures the target color, and then it generates a patient personal mixing recipe. So this is a quite extensive topic. There's YouTube videos that people can watch if they're interested in it, or come to our course in July in Sydney and then learn how to do it with a real patient case that you will be doing together with Matthias, together with my support, I will be there to support the courses.
Maybe we'll expand a little bit here, since you mentioned, but Sasha is coming to Sydney, and he will give a speech of the Academy of Australian and New Zealand prosthodontists. And we're so lucky because we're going to have him for 3 days here and run a course. The first day will be theory, open to everybody, clinician, and the day 2. Exactly.
So the first day, the theory and the dental photography for the dental practitioners and the technicians, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is very important for clinicians, not only for technicians. And obviously day 2 and 3 is hands-on, probably is more targeting technicians, in particular high-end technicians who want to do
patient case. So it's a patient case, not
the patient.
The patient case, yeah.
This is an amazing opportunity. Can I ask you a question about the gray card you have in there? Your first gray card was just gray, but now we see all of these colors in there. What's the difference?
So the first system was, the first gray card was just a gray reference object, and you just use it as a point of reference with a known reflectance so you can calibrate the lightness of the image, okay? So you do the white balance of the image in Lightroom, and then you change the exposure in the image until the reflectance value of the gray reference card is reproduced. That was the original protocol by Bengel and Chu in 2005. But then I added the global characterization to it. And what that meant was that I was traveling the world, doing all these eLAB courses around the world, and I would have a look at the camera equipment that the participants would take to the course. And every time somebody took a camera to the course that I hadn't characterized it, I grabbed it and I got my color checker and I took a photo of it and then ran it through software to characterize the sensor or the spectral sensitivity of this particular camera. And then I created a profile. And then we had a list of profiles, 120 profiles of cameras that I collected over the years. And they were called DCP profiles. And you had to import them into Lightroom to be able to link up different cameras with each other, right? So the problem with global characterization is 2 things. 1, you need access to the camera. You need to have physical access to the camera to characterize it. And 2, you are assuming that there is no difference between identical models. You're assuming that all D7500 are identical, which they're not, right? And so we switched to a new approach, and it's not a new approach, it's a different approach, which is this one here. And so there's a color checker on the gray card now, and this is called local characterization. So now, whenever somebody has a new camera that is bought from the shop, there's no requirement for me having it first so I can characterize it. Instead, they do it. So when they take a photo with a new gray card and they're spanking new camera, we characterize the sensor and we optimize the color measurement for tooth colors. That is called local characterization. So every time somebody takes a photo with a new gray reference card with their camera, then every one of those images has an individual ICC profile. Instead of using one ICC profile across all camera models, right? You have every image has its own ICC profile. So this has improved the inter-device agreement significantly and the precision of it as well, the repeatability as well. That's why the color checker is on this new gray card now. And for those of you who use intraoral scanning, you will have noticed that your intraoral scanner comes to the tip. And you're supposed to calibrate it every once a month or something like that. And when you look at the tip more carefully, what you'll see is also a color checker in there, and it also has earth colors, tooth colors in it for the same reason. So the sensor of the intraoral scanner will drift over time because of humidity and usage and all those things. So when you pop the tip on there and you do the calibration, it reads the values from the color checker. The XYZ coordinates for every patch are stored in the system, and it creates a new conversion matrix, a new ICC profile for the scanner for this month. And so that when you get the scan and you view it in your Trios software or Sirona Prime Scan software, you get a color rendition, right? That's the reason why they do it. It's also global characterization. Okay, so the technology is pretty much the same there.
Does that mean, Sasha, if I can interrupt, that the type of SLR camera or DSLR they use, it doesn't really matter. How cheap can you go?
As cheap as you want. So like
It doesn't matter.
If an entry model, you see, if one of the most popular cameras in the system is the Nikon D90. Lots and lots of people have Nikon D90, and that was launched like what 15 years ago, something like that. Okay, and you know, it was very good for its time. By modern standards, a fairly basic sort of camera. But imagine if that did something different than a D850, a current model, which is 10 times the price. Imagine that. The whole thing would fall apart. And of course, it doesn't. It doesn't. The only real improvement or in developments that we have seen with digital cameras, to be honest, in the last 10 years is the shift from taking still images to taking videos. That's it. I think the image capabilities have been
steady,
exhausted 10, 15 years ago, right? And now the game is, can I take videos with my camera? And can I take videos under low light conditions with my camera and that sort of thing? This is now, and this is why a lot of these mirrorless cameras or all mirrorless cameras today should be seen as video cameras that can take still images. That's how you have to look at it. It's not the other way around. They're not digital cameras that can take videos. They are video cameras, and they can also take still images.
Yes.
That's how one has to look at it.
What about the quality of a lens?
So the quality of the lens. So I'm just thinking about what the quality.
I can give you an example. I bought a 100 macro from Zeiss, which is supposed to be, according to review, the best clarity, the best, and I pay more than double than the 100 macro from Canon. And I have two Canon lenses, 100 macro, and the Zeiss are really, Toro is our ceramist in Piermont. He hates when I take photographs with a Zeiss macro, which is not even a 1:1. So it's very disappointing because you can't go to the distance you want, So I learned that. That more expensive doesn't necessarily mean better for what you have to do. You want to make a comment on that?
So the thing that I noticed, in the last, 10 years and hundreds of courses that I run around the world, there's a very, a very specific trend that, you have a certain type of people that rock up to the course with the biggest, clunkiest flagship camera.
That would be me.
And they're typically totally over-challenged, understanding what this thing does and what it can do, what all the buttons are for and everything, right? And it's just, it's the toy thing,
Yes.
I read this in a psychology book one day. They call it rationalization. So rationalization means that, the purchasing decision is purely emotional. And after you bought something, you find a rational reason why you needed it.
Yeah, that's definitely my case. I have cabinets,
that's why the
equipment. And actually, one of my cabinets is packed with diffusers. The type of shape, dimensions.
Yes.
We just spent another $2,700 from US dollars, actually, on diffusers. And I just noticed that it's so big. I mean, the photographs is very nice. They don't actually represent the appearance of the teeth. They blend everything. So even when you're doing something which is maybe not ideal, as you take a photograph with diffuser, they look amazing. So do you have any comments about this? Are they important for your protocol? Or what do you think about diffusers in general?
So we don't recommend the use of diffusers for shape quantification, color measurement, anything like that. It's totally counterproductive. We don't recommend that. So we're using data photography for color measurement. And if anything, you use a cross polarizer, which is necessary for the system, and just the naked flash to take a normal reflected image. Because like you say, people use diffusers to create, or bounces to create specific appearances and specific effects, right? And I wanted to understand what these effects are. What does this do to our images when we use different bounces and diffusers? And published this paper in 2016 with a close friend of mine, Michael Sangel, where we did this clinical study where we wanted to understand this. So basically, we photographed the same situation over again with different settings. So this is just the naked flesh with nothing on it. That's probably a fairly realistic depiction of how intraoral scene would appear if you saw it with your eyes. Then we got these plastic diffusers, they don't really do very much. Then we tried the LumiQuest diffusers. They've got this sort of translucent nylon material, and you can see how it changes the texture on the surface. Then as the size of the light field increases, as the softbox becomes bigger, right? You get more surface pronounced effects. This one has been quite popular for a while among, I think, the DSD people. They use these fans basically for a while. And this was all the rage in Europe 15 years ago. This is paper photography. So you just take a piece of printing paper. I'm sorry to disappoint Max. There's nothing you have to spend $7 grand on.
I've actually tried all of them. I have all of them.
Just take printing paper.
I try the paper as well.
And this probably has sort of the most kind of spectacular effect on this on using diffusers. And basically what we found is that it does two things. It changes the color temperature of the image. The color balance is changed by the diffuser. So the color temperature of the emitted light is changed, and it kind of confuses the camera. And the other thing is it pronounces the surface. It does something to the surface, the way, like on this picture here, the surface is so strongly pronounced, and the lobes and pericomata and things like that, it's difficult to tell how well the teeth actually match. And I think that's why people use this on purpose. So even if the single center doesn't match perfectly, right? Everything looks fantastic with paper. I did too. It looks spectacular.
Yes.
But that's more of a subjective choice. It's like whether you like A1s better than A3s, whether you like to photograph them straight, or whether you like to whether you like to use a diffuser. So you can see here with a naked flash, this is a xenon light, which are the flash bulbs that are inside a flash. This is xenon light. Is a very broad form of light. Okay, it's got a lot of energy across the visible spectrum. It's very similar to the solar spectrum, actually, right? Which is why they use it so often in spectrometers. Like just about every benchtop spectrometer that I know has a pulsed light source in it, because it has really good light. And xenon light is like daylight. It's D65, so it's about 6,500 Kelvin. It's a bluish light, and you can see it here, right? So the teeth have a whitish bluish appearance, right? And then when you change the color temperature, this looks more yellowy now, right? And this looks more reddish, and this looks more, warmer, using color language, right? Color terminology. So these are just changes of the color temperature. That's the only thing that it really does. And I can't tell you whether you should use them or not. I can tell you for color communication, they're not useful at all. They don't provide any advantage.
Good. Get rid of my cabinet. Sasha, I really enjoy this chat with you. I'm very thankful.
Thanks very much for having me.
You had a bit of time. If you don't mind, I just have my last question, which is a curiosity I always have when I talk to people like you. You have been very successful as a dental technician, and now you're helping other dental technicians to be as successful as you are. Can you tell us what you think has been important in your professional life, and what made you become the person you are today?
In a nutshell, to be honest with you, I think I was just very, very, very lucky to have met the right people over the course of my career to take me on and to mentor me. Even in an isolated place like Perth. I remember coming to Perth, and I was like in my late 20s. And somebody told me, "Oh, did you know that Perth is the most isolated city in the world?"
Dunedin, maybe more.
The largest isolated city in the
New
world.
Zealand,
Right?
more.
And that was just a totally unbearable thought for me as a young person. I come from the south of Germany, in the center of Europe. The heartland of dental technology, where everybody kind of knows everybody. The Italians are fantastic, colleagues. Italy is not far. There's a lot of exchange. There's always been a vibrant exchange between German and Italian dental technology throughout the 1980s, 1990s. Everything is very connected. And then you go to a place like Perth where nothing is connected. It's like literally the other end of the world sort of thing, right? And even still, even in a place like Perth, I found really good mentorship. Because for its isolation, or maybe because of its isolation, I don't know, it attracted a lot of really high-trained, highly skilled professionals in a place like Perth. You think of people like Pat Henry, who I never met, by the way. By the time I went there, he had retired, but it's obviously a legend in the field. I'm thinking of Lisa Mayford Heights, very famous name internationally. You wouldn't think that. The fact that Perth didn't have its own prosthodontic program for a very long time, and you either had to go to Sydney and Melbourne University for a long time, or Adelaide, I think, to do prosthodontics, right? And I know the pros programs in Australia, it's like two intakes per year, something like that. So it's highly competitive to get into prosthodontics. And so people often would go overseas and they do pros degrees in Michigan and places like that, and then come back to a place like Perth. We had older professionals like Ian Lander was an older prosthodontist in Perth, who was at the University of the Pacific in San Francisco for a long time. So you had this interesting ecosystem of prosthodontists, with very different, very diversified background and training,
Yes.
Whereas I would imagine in places like Melbourne and Sydney, you either went to Melbourne or you went to Sydney, right?
Yeah, surprisingly, in our program, there's lots of candidates coming from everywhere, even internationally. We had Glenn Lilo from Perth, graduated with me. Graham Carmichael, only 1 or 2 years after. We had Joshua from the same practice, and so on. Yes. Yeah.
So when I went to Perth, I was a master dental technician. I graduated from the master school here in Freiburg in Germany. But I think I really only became a dental technician in my time in Perth. I learned about dentistry and prosthodontics in Perth. The people that kind of probably influenced me the most is Brendan Joyce. He was the person, he had just come back and graduated from Melbourne when I set up my lab. So, just about the majority of the cases I've shown you I've done with Brendan Joyce. He's been a tremendous influence on me. Collected a lot of clinical experience. I think that's very important. Probably more important than a shape matching software, to be totally blunt and honest with you, is clinical experience for a dental technician. It's not economically viable. You don't make money going to the surgeries and attending every trying, but that's exactly what I did. I would go to the surgeries. I would attend every single trying, not just single centers, everything. They would get me to check the contact points with floss, because when you check the contact points in someone's mouth with floss, that's very different than doing it on a model.
Absolutely.
And as a ceramist and with an interest in color and color matching, the most valuable thing that I learned in this time through the sponsorship of others, people like Brendan Joyce, Brett Shepard, was to see how your restoration comes to life in a patient's mouth, and to calibrate yourself, because you work on stone models. There was a guy, Douglas Terry, he's Terry Douglas, so he's an American dentist from Texas, a friend of mine, and he published a paper in PPAD 25 years ago, and it was called Models Without Faces. And what he's saying is that as a dental lab technician, you work on a stone model with no face.
That's what it is.
That's all you have. So it helped me to calibrate myself to learn the difference between how something has to look on a model without a face to look just about right in the mouth. And that's the art of it. When you do courses, you have technicians that are too scared to put things in and, with their details. And then you see nothing, and it looks bland and boring in the mouth. And you have the bold ones, and they put stuff in there, and you go, oh, But that's a phase you go through, right? You go through that and until you calibrate yourself. So these are all the skill set that are really acquired in the largest, most isolated city in the world.
Okay, your answer was very humble. I believe that your skills, your curiosity, and your intelligence allow you to find good mentors as well. I think all things have to come together.
Yeah, so I read the obituary when Pat Henry retired. There was this I think he called obituary, right? In JPD or something.
Yeah.
It was a German State Dentistry, I can't remember. And he talked about his Magnificent Seven. So he was asked the same question. He talked about his Magnificent Seven. So it's other people, isn't it? It's other people.
Absolutely. Yes, well, Sasha, I believe that for you is almost lunchtime.
It is.
And for me, I'm a bit late for dinner, but just a few minutes. And for whoever is listening to us, I'm sure they have a new world has opened to them, because look, I study superficially color, and I learned a lot from just 1 hour of listening to you. And I'm really looking forward to see you in Sydney. And I just remind everybody that you'll be being there 19th, 20th, and 21st to run a course with Highlands Professional Development. More details are available on the website, www.highlandspd.com.au. And also, I hope that probably all my postgraduate students will be present on the first day. I hope they're not going to miss it and they're not too busy. And they will see you again at the Academy of the Australian New Zealand Prosthodontists. I think you lectured just before me. So
Yes.
Thank God, in 2 different topics. Mine will be more surgical. And 24th, 25th, and 26th, and 27th of July. So check the website, everybody, or contact me directly if you have any questions. Or Sasha. Sasha is so easy to find. I'm a little bit more difficult. And I'm available at mguazzato@yahoo.com.au. Sasha, thank you so much. And I see you in July, and we keep in touch from now to then. Thank you again. Enjoy your lunch.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.